They told the locals never to go near that barn. The year was 1899, a dying autumn in Vermont, when the first whispers began to crawl out of the dirt roads and smoke-choked taverns. Farmers spoke of a place where the air itself felt wrong, where livestock refused to enter, and where children who dared each other to cross the threshold returned pale, trembling, never speaking of what they saw. But inside, hidden beneath rotting timbers and dust-thick beams, lay something the world was never meant to see. A room lined with bodies, mummified, not buried. Not preserved by nature, but by design. Understand this: bodies do not mummify in New England's damp autumn air. They rot, they decay, they vanish into the soil. Yet here, inside this barn, the flesh clung to bone like parchment. The eyes were gone, but the mouths, twisted into something between a scream and a prayer, remained. Who placed them here? Why keep them hidden in a barn? A structure meant for life, harvest, survival. The first man to stumble upon it, a hunter tracking a wounded buck, returned vomiting, raving, his sanity fractured by what he'd glimpsed. His description chilled the entire town. Rows of figures bound in ritual poses, arms crossed, mouths sewn, chests carved with marks no preacher dared name. And at the center, upon a crude wooden chair, a figure taller than the rest, draped in a shroud blackened with pitch, its skull crowned with rusted iron thorns. The authorities never came. Not the sheriff, not the coroner, not the priests. Why? Because word never spread. The hunter was silenced, the barn quietly sealed. The land passed to a shadow trust whose owners never showed their faces. You see, this was not an accident. This was not insanity. It was a message, hidden in plain sight, buried in America's forgotten countryside. And now you, hearing this, are standing at that barn door. The truth is waiting for you inside, but once you cross, you can't go back. This isn't just a tale of corpses in wood. It's a key, a ritual, a blueprint of power that only the few were meant to hold. The rest, they were meant to live blind, never knowing what breathes behind the veil. The question is, will you enter? They wrapped it in silence. The town's complicity an invisible shroud, stitched by fear and favors. After the hunter's collapse, a single woman named Miriam tried to tell the story. A midwife with hands that knew the language of bodies. She swore she'd seen children carried to the barn in burlap sacks, brought by men with polite faces who smelled of oil and ledger paper. She swore the men spoke in low register about preservation and keeps, as if cataloging livestock. Before she finished, the church bells tolled and every door in the village was suddenly closed. You must understand how power burrows. It does not announce itself. It creates private languages, euphemisms, nicknames, ritual verbs, so that horrific acts become administrative tasks. The mummification inside that barn was not a quirk of climate. It was a method. Sequential desiccation, smoke curing, tannin baths drawn from bark, and oils infused with compounds a scientist today would call antiseptic and embalming. It took skill, equipment, and time. It took people who understood chemistry and who had the will to reduce human tissue to preserved tokens. The carvings on chests and shoulders were not idle graffiti. They were ownership marks, brands translated into sigils. They mapped lineage and debt, not ancestry. When those symbols match a ledger, the dead become entries, inheritances frozen into material form. Follow the money, and you find the respectable names. The banker who rerouted a railroad line, the minister who brokered marriages, the physician who patented a preserving formula. They called themselves stewards. They called it charity. Under those words, a commerce of the dead quietly thrived. This was not superstition. It was strategy. The barn was placed at a jurisdictional seam where records thinned and law deferred. Curiosity was punished economically and socially. A man who asked too many questions found his credit cut, his son's apprenticeship withdrawn, the price of his grain mysteriously lowered. The pattern is simple yet brutal. Remove witnesses, privatize outcome, codify silence. It's a playbook that repeats whenever elites wish to convert human life into perpetual assets. So when you comb old ledgers and find sudden inheritances, sealed wills or orphaned names that vanish into corporations, remember the barn, Remember how bodies were converted into currency and how fear became the glue that held it together. Those who kept the secret did so not for superstition, but for leverage. Once the dead are owned, the living bow faster than you imagine. This method repeats time. Hidden hands teaching other hidden hands, obedience amplification. The barn stood as a monument to obedience, not the kind won with sermons or swords, but the obedience born from engineered silence. Think about it. What terrifies a man more than death? It is the idea that even in death, he will not belong to himself. His body, his name, his essence transformed into an object in someone else's collection. That was the hidden terror of 1899 Vermont. Those mummies were not just corpses. They were statements, physical reminders that resistance was pointless. The few who dared whisper about it spoke in half-truths, disguised as folk tales. They'd say the barn was haunted, that spirits howled there at night. But the truth was darker. The screams were not from beyond, but from within. Testimonies claimed the process of preservation was not always applied post-mortem. Some were kept alive until the very moment the body ceased to function, locked in ritualistic stillness, so the final imprint of fear etched itself permanently into flesh. Mummification became a weapon of psychology, not merely chemistry. Understand this carefully. Trauma can be engineered, sculpted, frozen. Institutions have always known this. From the dungeons of medieval Europe to the basements of Cold War hospitals, trauma is the alchemy of control. If you can shatter a man, you can remold him. If you can display shattered bodies as warnings, you can bend entire communities into silence. The barn was not only a site of death, it was a theater of compliance. And here's where the pattern sharpens. When Miriam the midwife disappeared, replaced quietly by a stranger brought in from out of town, nobody asked questions. When farmers' sons vanished into boarding schools and never returned, the townsfolk muttered but never rebelled. They were made to believe rebellion was useless, that their fate was already sealed. This is how you build invisible prisons, not with walls, but with belief systems. Now ask yourself, how much of your life is already bound by such unseen structures? You clock into jobs you hate, swallow histories written by victors, and obey laws designed not for justice, but for extraction. You accept what you're told because the alternative, looking behind the curtain, feels like staring into the barn itself. The dead in Vermont were trophies, yes, but more than that, they were mirrors. Every sewn mouth whispered the same truth. Silence is not protection. Silence is submission. The barn was never an isolated aberration. That is the greatest lie, to make you believe horrors occur in fragments, mistakes of history, freak accidents. But the deeper one digs into the records of 1899, the more connections bleed through. In the rafters, tucked behind beams thick with soot, searchers decades later discovered crates of ledgers. Not diaries, not farm inventories, but coded accounts. Numbers aligned with initials. Initials tied to families, families tied to institutions. Each entry ended not with a dollar sign, but with a symbol. The same sigils carved into the mummified flesh. Those sigils were not just ritual marks. They were an accounting system. Imagine a hidden economy where human lives were collateral, where the body itself became both ledger and contract. The barn was not a mausoleum, it was a bank vault. And like all banks, it was plugged into a larger network. Follow the trails and you find familiar names. Trustees in Boston, shipping families in New York, mill owners in Connecticut. Their connections spread across insurance companies and law firms that still exist today. Wrapped in marble facades and golden logos, these men, respectable, untouchable, invested in silence. Their children sat in Harvard halls, their wives chaired charities, but their fingerprints reached into barns filled with the stench of treated corpses. The system was self-reinforcing. To rise in their world, you had to accept the contract of complicity. Ask too many questions and you found yourself excluded from trade routes, bank loans, political appointments. Submit and you gained wealth, land, security. They did not need to burn witches anymore. They mummified witnesses into currency, their bodies proof of ownership and compliance. The barn, you see, was both symbol and node in a web of psychological control. Locals told ghost stories because it was safer than truth. Authorities ignored it because they were either bought or bound. And the elite? They visited in secrecy, walking between rows of husks, learning the lesson carved into every shriveled chest. Power is not in belief, it is in the control of what men fear to believe. This is where history becomes dangerous. Because once you recognize that the barn was not a solitary nightmare, but a cog in a larger system, you must ask, how many barns, how many cellars, how many institutions exist even now, hidden behind polite facades, teaching the same lesson? And here's the truth, you've walked past them. You've donated to them. You may even trust them. The blueprint of the barn did not die with the rotted timbers. It migrated. It moved from fields into boardrooms, from ritual chambers into institutional designs. Consider the architecture of modern control: clinical rooms, padded rhetoric, bureaucratic checklists, standardized forms. These are not neutral tools. They are refinements of techniques that turned human beings into preserved objects. Where the barn used oils and smoke, institutions use language, procedure, and the slow drip of normalization. Look at how trauma is codified into manuals and memos. A hospital that insists on absolute conformity, a school that punishes curiosity, an agency that compartmentalizes people. These are laboratories of obedience. They teach a population to obey through small, repeated amputations of agency. Children raised in such systems learn to trust authority because authority shapes their survival. The barn taught with corpses. Modern systems teach with processes. Power became subtler. Threats are displayed economically and socially. Insurance clauses, non-disclosure agreements, credentialing boards, and best practices silence dissent under legitimacy. A man who speaks out risks his career, his family's security, his community standing. That is sufficient. The threat need not be visible. It must be visible to the ledger. The ledger is the modern barn. There is craftsmanship to this. Psychologists and administrators refine processes to elicit compliance, staged emergencies that create dependence, jargon that erases personal meaning, performance metrics that recalibrate moral horizons. The people who design these mechanisms wear respectable suits. They publish papers. They receive honors. But the moral calculus is identical to the men who salted bodies in 1899. To keep a system stable, sacrifice must be rendered acceptable and invisible. Understand the elegance and the cruelty. Systems that manufacture consent are engineered. They rely on repetition and the slow corrosion of moral imagination. You will not wake and realize you are complicit. Complicity is assembled in small acts over years. A polite refusal here, a whispered excuse there, an unasked question. It accumulates until a man is indistinguishable from the institution that molded him. This is the threat and the opportunity. Once you see the mechanics, you can resist them. Knowledge becomes the first antiseptic against institutional rot. But seeing is dangerous. Once recognized, the choice becomes raw. Act poorly, and you become the next preserved example for them. Which will you choose? The lesson of the barn was never about the dead. It was about the living who saw them and chose silence. That silence, that suffocating hush passed from father to son, neighbor to neighbor, is the true mummification. Not of flesh, but of will. The body becomes parchment, yes, but the spirit becomes inventory. That is how power survives generations without firing a single shot. Now trace the evolution. By the early 1900s, America's ruling families had perfected the art of turning trauma into policy. The barn was replaced by orphan asylums, workhouses, psychiatric wards, institutions where walls concealed not just suffering but experimentation. They claimed it was charity, reform, science. But the pattern was always the same: vulnerable bodies converted into data, data converted into currency, currency converted into dominance. And the marks. They no longer needed to be carved into chests. They were written into files, ID numbers, birth certificates, psychiatric diagnoses. Symbols that follow a man long after he leaves the building. Control without chains, ownership without whips. An invisible brand, just as binding as the sigils cut into mummified skin. Ask yourself, how many such brands have you accepted without protest? The social security number, the employment record, the medical file, the bank account, the credit score. Each one a ledger entry, each one a way to track and bind you. The difference is, you're alive to maintain your own submission, to feed the system with your compliance. The barn was primitive. Modern systems made it efficient. But here is the forbidden truth. Trauma is not just inflicted on individuals, but on entire populations. Wars engineered to shock nations into obedience, crashes that reset economies overnight, pandemics that reshape societies into patterns chosen long before the first case. Every large-scale trauma is an opportunity for control, and every trauma leaves behind its mummified remains, physical, psychological, symbolic, displayed as warnings to those who dare to resist. You are not living in the aftermath of the barn. You are living inside its perfected descendant. Its blueprint is everywhere, in schools that smother curiosity, in corporations that demand silence, in governments that rewrite truth in plain sight. The dead of Vermont were warnings, but you are the raw material. The question is no longer whether the barn existed. The question is, how many barns do you live inside right now without even seeing the walls? Fear is the embalming fluid of nations. It seeps into the marrow, slows the pulse of resistance, and stiffens the will until men move like corpses, animated only by commands. In Vermont, the sewn mouths of the mummified whispered that message: "Speak, and you will join us." Today, the stitching is invisible, but you feel it every time fear clamps down on your throat before you speak truth. Understand this. Fear has always been the architect of obedience. The barn was only a crude prototype. When its memory was erased, the method survived, disguised as governance, safety, morality. Fear of poverty keeps men chained to desks. Fear of rejection keeps them silent in the face of lies. Fear of punishment keeps them compliant with systems they know are corrupt. Just as the dead of the barn kept a village paralyzed, so too does institutional fear keep entire populations embalmed in compliance. Notice how fear is never random. It is curated. Newspapers in 1900 flooded readers with tales of epidemics, anarchists, foreign spies, all designed to shrink horizons. Today your screens carry the same medicine. Crisis after crisis, doom on a feed loop designed to desiccate the spirit. A man addicted to fear is easy to control because his imagination never strays outside survival. And a man who only survives never becomes dangerous to the system. The elites learned this lesson early. You don't need chains if you can engineer terror. The barn taught that trauma carved into flesh could silence a town. Modern society teaches that trauma broadcast through headlines can silence millions. Both serve the same master. But here's the poison you must recognize. Once fear embalms a society, it begins to crave its captor. The villagers of Vermont began to warn each other not to disturb the barn. They protected the very secret that enslaved them. And today, populations defend the institutions that crush them, waving flags for their wardens, chanting slogans written by their captors. That is the depth of control, when obedience feels like identity. You must ask yourself now, what fears embalmed you? Which unspoken terrors keep your mouth sewn shut? Poverty, isolation, humiliation. Until you rip those stitches, you remain one of the preserved, alive but not living. Distraction is the ritual mask of fear. Once the stitches are in place, once a society has been embalmed by terror, the next step is to keep it docile, lulled, entertained, diverted. The villagers in Vermont told ghost stories about the barn because it was safer than truth. Ghosts were manageable, even comforting compared to the idea that the most powerful men in town were carving sigils into human flesh. The story itself became a sedative. Look at our age. Fear without distraction would lead to revolt. So distraction must be constant, overwhelming, and seductive. Bread and circuses were the Roman cure. Today it is streaming feeds, viral spectacles, consumer rituals, celebrity worship. Not accidents, rituals. Distraction is ritual because it transforms trauma into routine, converts horror into spectacle, and makes captivity feel like choice. The same minds that once built barns now build algorithms. The walls have changed, but the purpose remains. Understand the genius of this. Distraction hides the mechanics of obedience while keeping men too exhausted to resist. While you laugh at stage debates, your wealth is siphoned. While you rage at orchestrated scandals, new laws are inked. While you chase empty pleasures, entire systems calcify around you. You are meant to be busy, endlessly busy, guarding the ghost stories while the real horror thrives unchecked. The villagers of 1899 stood by that barn, whispering legends too paralyzed to torch it, too blind to face what sat inside. And so, the elites could return night after night to perfect their rituals without resistance. Today, the same cycle unfolds. We argue over shadows, defend illusions, and guard the very institutions built to devour us. It is a theater of obedience, designed so we volunteer as both audience and actors. But distraction is more than entertainment. It is anesthesia. It keeps you from feeling the pain of your own submission.
A man numbed will not rebel.
A man occupied will not awaken. This is the hidden agenda, to mummify not the body but the spirit, until you stand upright like the husks in that barn, eyes hollow, lips sealed, but still technically alive. Here's the question you must face. What distractions are you guarding as if they were your own children? What illusions have you mistaken for freedom? Until you strip them away, you remain embalmed in rituals designed to own you. The deeper you look, the clearer it becomes. These systems of control were never accidents. They were archived, codified, and handed down like sacred heirlooms. The barn in Vermont was not just a chamber of corpses, it was a library. Those ledgers hidden in the rafters were not for the villagers. They were instructions for successes. A manual of how to own men through silence and fear. Power protects itself through continuity. Do you think the men behind the barn left their methods to chance? No. They documented everything, symbols, techniques, financial flows, so their sons could inherit not just wealth but dominion. These archives passed quietly into the vaults of trusts, law firms, and fraternal orders. To the uninitiated, they were curiosities, dusty records. But to the initiated, they were handbooks of manipulation, templates for new institutions, blueprints for obedience. You've seen fragments of these manuals without knowing it. Corporate policy handbooks that read like scripture, government files that reduce citizens to codes, educational curricula designed to standardize minds rather than sharpen them. These are modern derivatives of the same archives that preserved the rituals of the barn. The language is sanitized, but the intent is identical. To convert the unpredictable chaos of human beings into predictable assets. And here is where it grows darker. These archives were not hidden away in dusty basements. They were institutionalized. Yale's secret societies, Harvard's restricted clubs, Masonic halls, all incubators where successors were groomed, tested, initiated. The knowledge was not democratized. It was restricted, parceled out in doses to ensure loyalty. Obedience was the price of entry. And so, generation after generation, the methods of psychological embalming refined themselves, hidden beneath the veneer of tradition and respectability. Do not misunderstand. These were not just dusty elites hoarding symbols. They understood something primal, that men crave order, crave belonging, crave identity. They weaponized this craving, giving their initiates a taste of forbidden power in exchange for lifelong silence. The same silence that kept a town from speaking of the barn, kept entire nations from speaking of their captors. And now, I turn the mirror toward you. If you've listened this far, you've already begun trespassing into the archive. You've opened a door most men never knew existed. Which means you now face the same choice the villagers faced. Remain silent, or speak, and risk joining the preserved identity. That is the final prison, the cage within the mind. Once the body can be catalogued, once fear embalms the will, the last step is to reforge a man's very sense of self. This is the most dangerous inheritance of the barn, the art of identity control. Think about those mummified bodies in Vermont. They were displayed not merely as corpses but as examples. Their mouths sewn shut, their chests carved with sigils, each became an emblem of what happens to those who resist. Over time, the villagers didn't just fear the barn. They built their identity around avoiding it. They defined themselves by obedience. That is the essence of control. When you no longer need chains because a man polices himself from the inside out. Fast forward. Look at our institutions today. They don't merely demand your obedience, they shape your identity. Schools do not ask you to learn, they ask you to become what they design. Corporations do not just buy your labor, they buy your persona, scripting how you present, how you speak, how you think. Governments do not just regulate behavior, they brand identities, citizen, alien, offender, patient, dependent. And once branded, you begin to act the part, guarding your own cage with pride. The hidden archives perfected this. They understood the human hunger for belonging, the terror of being an outcast. So they weaponized it. They gave you archetypes: worker, patriot, believer, rebel, each one already written, pre-approved, safe for the system. Even rebellion is commodified, sold back to you as an identity that still obeys hidden rules. The barn was crude in its carvings. Today's marks are psychological, etched into the fabric of who you believe you are. Here is where the descent grows sharper. Once you recognize that much of your identity is constructed by external powers, a terrifying realization hits. Who are you, truly, when the stitched mouth is ripped open? The elites count on you never asking that question. They count on you embracing the identity they gave you, defending it, killing for it, even dying for it. And in that sense, you become both the villager and the mummy, living flesh embalmed by borrowed identities. Now listen closely. If you have made it here, you are already peeling back those stitches. And I will ask you to prove it. Comment below this phrase twice: "I will not be mummified." Not once, but twice. That is the ritual break. That is the signal to yourself and to the algorithm that you are no longer content with the role they assigned you. Say it. Twice. Lock it in. The most brilliant form of tyranny is the one that requires no tyrant. When identity itself is rewritten, populations no longer need chains, guards, or gallows. They become their own wardens. They surveil themselves. They punish themselves. They whisper against each other in the name of belonging. That is the perfection of control. The barn made into a living, breathing society. In 1899, Vermont, the villagers never stormed the barn. They never burned it down. They never rose against the men who brought burlap sacks through its doors. Why? Because they had already accepted the rules of their invisible prison. The threat had done its work. Each family became an enforcer of silence, a self-policing cell. The elites didn't need to hire guards. The villagers did the guarding for them. This pattern metastasized. By the 20th century, self-policing was woven into the very fabric of modern life. Consider it. When you censor your own words because they might cost you your job. When you nod along to lies because speaking truth feels like social suicide. When you rat out a neighbor or co-worker not out of conviction, but to protect yourself. Every time you do this, you are not living. You are embalming yourself. The system smiles. You've become the mummy, voluntarily stitched, and what's worse, you will defend the prison. Think of how people rage when their illusions are challenged. Confront a man with truth about his government, his religion, his education, and watch his fury. Not at the liars, but at you. He has fused his identity to the cage. He cannot tear down the walls without tearing down himself. That is why the archives focus on identity, because once a man becomes his own jailer, he will fight to the death to protect his captivity. This is how entire societies become embalmed. Without barns, without rituals, without visible chains. The villages were a rehearsal. You are the performance. Today, billions live inside self-policing mechanisms, algorithms that manipulate desire, laws that exploit fear, cultures that demand conformity, and they call it freedom. So I ask you, in your own life, where are you the warden of your own silence? Where are you stitching your own mouth shut before anyone else can? Answer honestly, and you will glimpse the scale of the prison. Ignore it, and you will remain embalmed, standing upright in the grand barn of history, perfectly preserved, perfectly obedient. Erasure is the final act of mastery. Once the barn taught obedience, once identities were rewritten, the next step was to erase the inconvenient evidence. History is never neutral. It is curated, sanitized, rewritten. The barn in Vermont disappeared from maps, from newspapers, from official records. Witnesses vanished. Midwives like Miriam were replaced with strangers. Files were locked. Legends were invented. Memory itself was weaponized. This is how control becomes timeless. A truth once inconvenient is not confronted, it is buried. And not just physically, but psychologically. You begin to doubt your own recollection. You begin to trust the record over the experience. The mummies were not just dead, they were deleted. And generations later, men believed there had never been a barn at all. Consider this carefully. Every time history is rewritten, a barn is rebuilt. Sometimes it is literal, sometimes symbolic. Wars are sanitized, crimes concealed, atrocities disguised as accidents or folklore. The system does not need to threaten you directly. It simply ensures that the past is invisible. And if the past cannot be seen, the lessons cannot be learned. Obedience becomes default. Fear becomes second nature. Silence becomes instinct. The most dangerous form of erasure is the one embedded in institutions. Schools that teach sanitized history, corporations that hide internal abuses, governments that reclassify documents. All these are barns in another form, structures that store the truth out of reach, shaping your perception and conditioning your decisions. And by the time the veil is lifted, many have forgotten to look, or worse, they actively defend the erasure. You may think you are awake, but the archives of control extend far beyond memory. They shape law, culture, economics, and identity. They tell you who you are, what you can hope for, and what to fear. And if you challenge them, the punishment is subtle but pervasive. Isolation, ridicule, economic loss, social death. Like the villagers, you may think you are safe obeying the invisible rules. The barn was not a warning. It was a curriculum. Now recognize the danger in knowing. Knowledge of erasure is a double-edged sword. It empowers, yes, but it also makes you visible to those who maintain the system. Once you remember, once you see the barns in the world around you, you cannot unsee. And the choice is stark. Adapt and resist, or be reabsorbed willingly into the ledger of the embalmed. The barn was a laboratory of fear, but its true legacy lies in the mind. Modern systems of control are the barn writ large. Psychological manipulation scaled to entire populations. Think of advertising, media, politics, social hierarchies. Each is a ritualized form of influence, designed to shape thought, emotion, and behavior without ever showing a whip or a chain. Fear remains the embalming fluid, distraction the anesthetic, and identity the cage. Consider the subtlety. Algorithms curate your desires and anxieties. News feeds amplify terror. Marketing crafts illusions of status and belonging. Every choice you make is influenced, every belief softly sculpted. This is modern mummification. Living men embalmed in conformity, unaware of the process. You are not coerced. You are trained. You are not shackled. You are disciplined into invisible obedience. The barn perfected fear. Modernity perfected its application. And the archives, they persist hidden in plain sight. Policies, procedures, and educational structures encode lessons for successors, much like the ledgers in the Vermont rafters. Children are conditioned to comply, employees to conform, citizens to accept limitations. Every small act of obedience strengthens the system. Every self-imposed restriction is a stitch in the invisible shroud. This is why rebellion feels impossible, not because systems are omnipotent, but because they have converted compliance into instinct. People defend what controls them, just as the villagers guarded the barn without realizing it. Modern men defend institutions, habits, and beliefs that erode their freedom, mistaking comfort for liberation, ritual for choice. But recognition is a weapon. Understanding the mechanics of psychological control allows you to step outside them. Awareness is the first act of desecration against the system's invisible barns. When you see the patterns, fear, distraction, identity manipulation, you gain leverage. You may still walk among the mummified, but you are no longer one of them. Here is the perilous truth. Once you recognize the barn's legacy, you cannot unsee it. And the elites know this. That is why knowledge is fragmented, censored, hidden behind euphemisms and respectable facades. But fragments are enough. A man who pieces together the system sees the cages others accept, the silent agreements that perpetuate control, and the invisible rituals that keep men obedient. Resistance is never comfortable. The villagers of Vermont who glimpsed the barn and tried to speak, to act, were destroyed. Not always by violence, but by isolation, fear, and erasure. The same principle applies today. To step outside the system is to court danger. Social exile, financial penalties, ridicule, even subtle forms of institutional retaliation. The more powerful the system, the more invisible the chains, and the more severe the consequences for those who resist. Yet resistance is the only path to freedom. To see the barn for what it is, To recognize the modern equivalents in media, corporations, and institutions is to awaken. But awakening is not passive. It requires decisiveness, courage, and relentless observation. Those who resist cannot simply ignore fear. They must confront it, dissect it, and turn it into a tool rather than a shackle. The barn taught that lesson brutally. Only those willing to face the horror without blinking could survive and learn. History is littered with those who tried. Some disappeared quietly, erased from memory. Others fought and paid with lives, but left fragments of knowledge that persist. These fragments are coded warnings, blueprints for understanding the mechanisms of control. They teach the same lesson as the barn. Systems that mummify the living are defeated not by direct confrontation, but by the subtle art of refusing participation. By reclaiming choice one stitch at a time, you must understand the stakes. Resistance is not heroic entertainment. It is painstaking, psychologically exhausting, and lonely. You will be misjudged, ridiculed, and sometimes hunted by those who have embraced the invisible system fully. But every act of refusal, every truth spoken, every illusion peeled back, becomes a fracture in the armor of control. The barn was contained because the villagers obeyed. Modern barns, social, political, corporate, thrive only when men maintain their own chains. Break your own, and the structure begins to tremble. This is where men are tested. Will you accept the safety of obedience, or will you embrace the danger of knowledge? Will you remain embalmed in identity not your own? Or will you carve a path into clarity where fear is recognized, distraction is pierced, and the ritual of erasure no longer governs your perception? Resistance is a teacher as demanding as the barn itself, but it is the only one that offers true freedom. Here is the final dangerous truth. The barn is not behind you. It is not a relic of 1899 Vermont. Its lessons pulse through the veins of every institution, every system, every hierarchy that touches your life today. You may call it corporate policy, government oversight, social expectation, but underneath, it is the same architecture of obedience. Fear, distraction, identity control, erasure, they are all present, evolved, perfected. The mummies may have decayed, but their method survives, refined, invisible, and far more lethal. Walk into your office. Look at the rituals. Emails that must be answered immediately, meetings that consume your focus, performance metrics that dictate your worth. Every procedure is a subtle stitch in the shroud. Step into politics, education, media, or finance, and the pattern repeats. Compliance is rewarded. Curiosity is punished. Those who ask inconvenient questions are quietly exiled. Those who conform ascend. You are living in the perfected barn, and it does not need doors, locks, or chains. You are the vault. You are the ledger. You are the keeper and the kept. But recognition is power. Understanding that the mummification continues in modern forms grants you leverage. Awareness allows you to navigate the system without surrendering to it. It allows you to see who is orchestrating fear, who is curating distraction, and which rituals enforce identity that is not your own. Once seen, you can act selectively, deliberately, strategically. You can break the habit of self-surveillance, pierce the illusions of authority, and reclaim autonomy over your body, mind, and choices. Here is the test. Most men never reach this point. They hear fragments, shiver at shadows, but retreat to comfort. They choose safety over truth, distraction over awakening. The barn teaches that fear alone will enforce compliance, but insight, once claimed, cannot be unlearned. The man who sees the system cannot return to ignorance. The mummies, the ledgers, the sewn mouths, they are all symbols for what happens when obedience is internalized. The lesson is brutal, and it is precise. Freedom demands awareness, courage, and sacrifice. Now look at your own life. Where are the barns? Which rituals are shaping your identity without your consent? Which fears are stitched into your decisions, your habits, your sense of self? To answer is to step into danger. To ignore is to remain embalmed, upright, and obedient, waiting for a warden who will never arrive, because the warden is you. Here is the final descent, the truth most men cannot bear. The barn, the mummies, the sewn mouths, the ledgers, they were never about death. They were about mastery over life itself. And the cruelest trick, the system does not need to imprison you physically. Because once it reaches the mind, once it infiltrates identity, you are already a voluntary inmate. The villagers of Vermont were not chained, they were compliant. You, sitting now, are surrounded by invisible chains of the same design, refined over centuries, updated for the modern age. Understand this. Fear, distraction, identity control, and erasure are not mere tactics. They are cumulative, like the layers of a tomb built around consciousness. Every compromise you have made, every unasked question, every choice to look away, each stitch has contributed to your own embalming. But the final revelation is also a promise. Knowledge is the solvent. Once you see the mechanisms at work, you are no longer helpless. You cannot be unseen, unawakened, or unchallenged. The barn, the mummies, the system. They exist only as long as you participate in the ritual of silence. So step back and look at your world with unflinching eyes. The media that distracts you, the work that occupies you, the systems that define who you are, all of it can be penetrated. Identify the rituals that bind you. Recognize the fears that stitch your lips. See the illusions that masquerade as identity. And then act. Speak when others remain silent. Refuse when others comply. Question when others obey. Each small act of defiance is a chisel against the walls that have held humanity in quiet submission for centuries. And here is your final challenge. The barn is within you, but so is its antidote. You cannot unsee the truth, but you can choose the role you play. Will you remain upright, embalmed, a voluntary participant in your own captivity, or will you step forward, tearing apart the ritual, breaking the stitches, reclaiming your body, your mind, your identity? The choice is yours, and it is dangerous, exhilarating, and utterly transformative. Remember the phrase you repeated earlier, "I will not be mummified." Let it echo in your actions, your choices, your perception. Twice spoken, twice affirmed. This is the ritual that frees you, that wakes you, that separates you from the millions who continue to live as silent, obedient husks. You now stand at the edge of awareness, staring into the void behind the barn where the hidden masters once walked. Step through it and nothing will ever be the same. The barn is not gone. It lives in every system, every ritual, every shadow that seeks obedience. But now so do you.